having problems amongst themselves, to create tensions within the system to allow for their, allow for their candidate, if in the case of like an election, say in a small African country in the 60s or 70s, to emerge as sort of a savior. We saw this time and time again throughout the Soviet period, and now because Russia is the sort of rump of of the Soviet Union, the Russian Republic has it's a waning power, and so now really the chaos is most beneficial to them. Anything they can do to drag us and quite frankly the Chinese down, right, which are the two main competitors for the Russians, we'll see that. Chinese are a little bit different in this side, but again, you don't hear me talking a lot about cyber, because the way I cut into this problem set and the way intelligence cuts into this is as a practice of intelligence. These are intelligence and security officers that are using these different approaches and skills, and that's enabled through the cybersphere, through computers and the internet in particular. I'll mute.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. We actually had our first question come in, and I think that you would be the best person to answer this. It's from Taylor. Even if we are able to have a strong intelligence team to prevent outsiders from interfering, how can we prevent problems and biases within / do some people even want to prevent these biases?
Well, it's a really good question, and Taylor, I hope you find the answer to that. I mean, we're all trying to understand how to mindfully address that exact issue, right? So, I mean, and this is really the interesting thing about this. The Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, to a smaller extent, are really just taking advantage of our own weaknesses. Really, this comes into a newer literature or a newer set of ideas that we call asymmetric warfare, asymmetric conflict, and increasingly the new buzzword is hybrid warfare, right? So this is sort of the information operations side of things. So what you look for is the weakness within your adversary, and you exploit that. And that's essentially what they've done. It's very easy for them to take advantage of problems we already have amongst ourselves, like the race issue. Like the law enforcement issue, that's obviously tied to the race issue, and when you have a highly politicized or galvanized society, it makes it really easy to just sort of start fights between people, and then we degrade ourselves. So the way really out of this is to try to figure out what is that pole that we can all kind of touch. And hang toward that defines us as Americans, that makes us, this country what it is. And I think right now we're really struggling to figure out what that is. And you're living through it. It's a scary time. I wish the dog days were over, as Florence and the Machine were tried to tell us there. It's just Florence, but Florence and the Machine. But they're not. They're here. We're in the midst of it, and it's an incredibly exciting time to be studying this as it unwinds in front of us. It provides a whole host of challenges to us, to the way that we think about it, because it's very easy to be myopic when you're sort of in the middle of the melee, if you will, right in the middle of the conflict. But it's also incredibly exciting and a great opportunity to be leaning into something like this and trying to address the challenges that are in front of us. I hope I answered your question, Taylor.
I think that was a great answer. And I also think that's a perfect segue to go over to Dr. Morris to talk about it from the political science perspective. And I think you're exactly right. This is a really exciting time to be studying all of this and learning about this. And Dr. Morris, I'd love to hear your input on the question that's been posed for this evening, as well as maybe some of Dr. Corpora's comments.
Yeah, no, I thought that was wonderful. And actually, there's a lot of connections between what I do here in political science and what's done in Intel. But I have to tell you that since 2016, my students have been really eager to discuss foreign influence on US elections. I mean, it has been a topic that they raise all of the time in almost every class. And they've tended to ask the same couple of questions over the last couple of years, and that is, who did what and why did they do it? And in many ways, that's not surprising, because those are the types of things we want to know in political science. We want to know who's behaving in a certain way and why they're behaving that way. But things have changed this year. Since the beginning of this semester, students haven't been concerned about who did what and why they did it. They've been instead focused on a potential target for cybersecurity or cyber attacks on the United States, where foreign influence might have the ability to sow discord and maybe disrupt our political system in a way that it hasn't been disrupted since, say, the Civil War. And the question that they're asking is, what would happen if US citizens, if voters, US citizens lost faith in the idea that their election, that the election results were legitimate? What would happen if Americans lost faith that this election machinery didn't deliver the way or what it promised to deliver? And this is, I think, a really important question and has highlighted a real vulnerability. I mean, forever, as long as I've been doing this, so that's forever, right? I've been doing it for 20 years. But for as long as I've been doing this, we've always taken the results of our elections as being the way things are, that we can have faith in what happens on election day. This year, it seems a little bit different. Now, historically, there's been a lot of reasons that people have come up with to doubt our elections, to maybe make the case that they are unfair. I mean, for example, voter registration has always kept a lot of people out of the loop that might otherwise vote. But today, that's really not an obstacle anymore. I mean, you can register to vote from your bed in your pajamas if that's what you choose to do. You can do it online in most states. Another challenge for democracy, and one of the reasons why people have kind of questioned elections in the past, has to do with the resources available at our polling places. I mean, we've all seen on television the long lines that exist in some places, and this is kind of a disincentive for people to actually cast a vote, and it raises the question about whether our elections are fair. We've also had, I mean, any number of issues, but recently we've seen the emergence of laws that require people to present IDs at polling places. And for a while, we were really concerned that this might be a big disincentive for people to vote. But the reality of it is that strict voter ID laws only exist in 7 states. In the remaining 43, you don't have to have an identification, any form of identification at all to vote. So this really never manifested as a problem that might call into question the foundation of our democratic process. But this year is entirely different. We have a new question being raised about the legitimacy of our electoral process, and that has to do with mail-in ballots. We are seeing in this election year a surge in the number of people who are casting their ballots by mail. And the numbers are staggering. Compared to 2016, you almost really can't compare them. There's so much difference between the two. And these ballots are being requested for mail-in voting in systems that really aren't designed to deal with that capacity of ballots. Historically, we've had relatively few people vote by mail. Most people show up on election day. And so people are beginning to question whether or not this mail-in process is going to be fair. If people who are allowed to vote or are legally allowed to vote are having their votes counted maybe, and maybe whether people who are not legally allowed to vote are having their votes counted. If you think about it, more than 70 million mail-in ballots have been requested nationwide. That's 70 million mail-in ballots nationwide, including 2 million mail-in ballots in each of 4 critical states in this election: Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. This far exceeds the number of requests made in 2016. You almost can't compare them. And in all likelihood, tens of millions of voters will cast their ballots by mail this year. Already, over 3 million ballots have been returned through the mail process. So there's no doubt that mail-in voting is going to be incredibly important. if it turns out that only a tiny fraction of those voters submit their ballots by mail, that tiny fraction could make the difference between whether Joe Biden is elected or Donald Trump, whether we have a Democratic Senate or a Republican Senate. Take Michigan, for example. In 2016, it was critical in the election of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump won that state by only 11,000 votes. That's a tiny fraction of the 2.6 million mail-in ballots that have been requested in that state. So if we end up questioning whether it's a foreign government or whether this questioning is something that emerges domestically from inside of the United States, if we begin questioning the integrity of our electoral process, this could have profound implications, not just for who wins a presidential election or who controls the Senate, but our society as a whole. So this is the target that my students are most concerned about when it comes to cyber attacks on the United States in the upcoming election.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. We actually had a couple questions come in, and I think we might be able to combine them into one big top discussion, and it's about our voting process. So Taylor asked again, do you believe it's still a good idea for people to question the voting process since it's a process that will impact our country and the world greatly? And did our current situation bring to light the need to amend our system? And then we have another question from Kendra. Do you think voter fraud is as prevalent as the media makes it out to be? Has it been an issue in less controversial elections, for example, before 2008? Those are two different things, but I think they're the same issue. So I don't know if you can touch on each of them together or if you want to do it separately.
Sure, I'll handle them both in one if that's okay. I'll do my best to do that. Those are really good questions. And believe it or not, those are the types of questions I get every day in class. And they're difficult questions to answer. The way we run elections is largely determined by state governments. States are responsible for organizing elections. So if there's going to be meaningful reform in how we do voting, it has to be done in 50 states. And that makes it incredibly challenging. So I think this electoral process, election year, has called into question how we do elections, how we count ballots, whether or not we should allow mail-in voting, early voting. And I think it's something that is going to be talked about. I think there's going to be a great discussion at the state level over the next several years. This year, we need to get through it with the mechanisms we have in place and do the best we can with those mechanisms. The other question concerned?
It was voter fraud.
Yeah, okay.
Is voter fraud as prevalent as the media makes it out to be?
Yeah, the answer is no, it's not. Voter fraud, there's been very little evidence, and that is social scientific evidence, evidence that I would rely on as a social scientist to suggest that there's any widespread voting fraud. Simply not documented. Are there specific instances of it? There probably will be. We see those from time to time. But in terms of large-scale voter fraud, we just don't see evidence of it. Have we seen it in the past? Well, not since we made major reforms in the early 20th century that made voting fairer. The process was more transparent. We began requiring people to register to vote officially through state mechanisms. Those things really did away with the voter fraud that we saw, say, in the late 19th century. So really, from my perspective, there's really no reason to doubt that our election results will be fair and unbiased and everything they have been in the past. I think what we have to worry about is people's perception. Even if it's not the case, if people perceive that to be true, then we have a problem.
I think that's a great answer to both of those questions. So thank you for that. And
Sure.
Now I think we'll transition over to Dr. Mansour to talk about the cyber component of this question and, you know, the security of our elections. So Dr. Mansour, I'm going to let you answer this question now.
So I'm going to take it from what Dr. Morris and Dr. Corpora have discussed already. So we all agree that elections play a vital role in a free and fair society and are a cornerstone of any democracy, right? Now, as cybersecurity experts, we believe that there is a fundamental link between the trust in the infrastructure of the elections and the confidence the public place in basic democratic functions. So a secure and resilient electoral process is a vital national interest at the nation level or any nation that needs to preserve a democracy. So that's why we have to discuss the cyber threats that can face any election. The outcome of the elections has an enormous impact on the political and cultural landscape of each society. And it is this influence that makes organizing elections at the state level, at the federal level, what techniques they use, what machines, what voting records, and everything involved in the election process is vital. Now, there is a solid belief among cybersecurity experts that the main motivation behind election fueled attacks or cyber attacks or cyber threats against election, as Dr. Morris said, is to spread distrust among voters against their own government or the election process that they have. And this is dangerous. And especially when you say, oh, the technology is faulty and it has been proven that it can be attacked and it has been proven that it can be destroyed or changed. Now, from a cyber perspective, what are the things that threaten any election process? Before we can talk about the different threats that face the election process, we have to understand that the election infrastructure is comprised of a diverse set of systems, networks, and processes. You go from voter registration to poll books to voting machines, and each voting machine is supplied from a different supply chain. Each state uses a separate kind of voting machine. So it's very difficult to keep track of those things at the federal level and let alone at the state level. So basically, before we discuss the threats, we have to understand what are the basic assets in every election process. The Department of Homeland Security, for example, mentions these assets to be voter registration databases and all the IT systems associated with it, the election management systems, including the counting of votes, auditing of votes, displaying the election results on websites, the voting systems themselves, the operating system functioning underneath that voting machine, the transmission of results on over what network and what technology, the storage facility, who gets access to those machines physically, how are these machines stored for an election, where are these machines placed, and other critical infrastructure, including power grids and communication links. So those are all assets for every election process, and those are all attack surfaces for cyber criminals. So for example, hacking a voting machine is very simple. It has been proven to be done in less than 2 minutes. It took an 11-year-old kid in DEF CON conference a couple of years back, using in 2018, they organized something called Hacking the Voting Village. Kids in the age of 11 to 14 years old were able to hack into voting machines by simple Google search or by simply playing around with that voting machine. Now, on average, it has been proven that for an individual to vote on a voting machine, on an electronic voting machine, it takes around 6 minutes. But if you can hack it underneath 2 minutes, what if there's an insider threat and any team who can stand next to the voting machine, plug in a flash drive, or reformat the software, which takes less than 2 minutes, and then end up changing the results, therefore threatening the integrity and the outcome of the election? Those are the things that our cyber criminals trying to do and trying to spread. Now, is it that possible to do that at a massive scale? No, it is very difficult. And that's what makes us a little bit rest assured that it's not going to happen at a large scale and we can still trust our election system. So it's going to be very difficult to go undetected across all these polling stations nationwide, across all these different polling machines. And the fact that there is, voting machines. And the fact that there's different vendors of voting machines used by each state makes these kind of activities very difficult. So what would attackers now try to do? Well, they would try to perform what we call denial of service attack, which we discuss massively in our courses. So this is basically involves flooding a particular system, flooding a particular machine with so many requests that that system cannot handle it anymore and it breaks. Now, we are discussing, Dr. Morris just brought up the idea of how long is the line of voting usually? Now we're talking in the middle of a pandemic where there's social distancing. So can you imagine how long will the line be? So this is crazy dangerous. You have to wipe the machine to be sanitized and all these things. That's a problem because the availability of those machines is an essential factor for those voters to cast their vote. So this is something the hackers can benefit from and can launch a massive denial of service attack in order to basically deny the availability of those devices. The other factor is the website breaches. There are websites to basically display the preliminary results or the results and the communication channels between those different systems. Those channels needs to be secure to transfer the data securely. If unencrypted, they could be victim to eavesdropping, which is basically snooping, disclosing the data in an unauthorized manner to the public. And this also can spread fake news for fake election results and also makes the election questionable. And you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So these could expose non-public voter registration information. This could change voter registration information. This could expose ballot information. This could change the voting machine to expose voter choice or even change the voter choice within the machine. And that's a dangerous aspect. And it could expose unofficial information that is not supposed to go publicly. And lately in the third quarter of 2020, we've seen the rise of ransomware attacks doubling from the second quarter of the same year. These ransomware attacks also could threaten the election. What ends up happening is, what if a ransomware ends up encrypting all the information for the campaign of a particular candidate or for a particular machine, makes it unavailable or makes it not usable unless they pay ransom? Should we pay the ransom? And then comes the US government and says, no, don't pay the ransom, because at the end of the day, if you are paying a ransom, you are funneling money back to hackers to do ransomware attacks, more sophisticated, or you might be threatening, exposing yourself to lawsuits or legal action because you might be dealing with hackers or attackers from countries where the US have imposed sanctions on them. So again, you fall, what should you do here as a local entity organizing an election? Should you pay the ransom because you need the machine to be active during election day because that's important? Or no, make it unavailable, but then you have votes you lose. What should you do? And there's the phishing campaigns and social engineering campaigns, which basically try to spread fake news, to trick election staff officials to download malicious software, to do any kind of bad action or nefarious actions behind the scenes on all these voting technology that we use. So this is extremely dangerous. And the whole objective is, though, again, to spread distrust with the process, the democratic process, as Dr. Morris said.
Thank you for that, Dr. Mansour. We actually had a question come through for you as well. How do we weigh the risks of cybersecurity versus practicality when it comes to paper ballots versus voting machines? Dr. Morris, you may also have something to say about this, but I'd like to start with Dr. Mansour since we're following up on your discussion here.
The risks associated with voting machine is, in my opinion, is higher than just paper ballots because as per my understanding, and Dr. Morris can verify that, paper ballot is tracked and it's going to be matched at the end, on the end side with a record of voter registration. But the threat with a voting machine or a voter registration system or a voter registration website is higher because if that website is not secure, then that voter registration could not go through, preventing the voter from casting the vote. That's where the threat is, right? Whereas in a paper ballot, that could be eliminated at the end side when it's compared to the voter registration data. I don't know if I answered the question, but Dr. Morris can add more about the ballot there.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, you know, one of the major impetuses for changing from paper to electronic ballots was the election of 2000, which was an absolute disaster in places like Florida. Those of you who are here tonight, our prospective students, are too young to remember this, but it was an absolute disaster. We had people trying to count or determine whether or not a voting machine managed to push a chat out far enough so does it count as a vote, and they're holding it up to the light, and they're literally recounting tens of thousands of votes in places like Florida. And that moved us to change things. And my fear is that, you know, Americans tend to not do things until they need to. Don't fix it unless it's broke. I fear that we're going to continue down the road that we're headed, and at some point something's going to break and we're going to have to fix it. But you know, I agree with absolutely everything that was said. I mean, there's definitely a trade-off there.
I agree with that. And I think as we're moving further into a society with more technology and becoming more reliant on it, it's going to become a much bigger question as we go into more of these types of processes that rely so heavily on technology and networks and things like that. Dr. Garase, I'd like to switch gears and move into the criminal justice field with this particular question too. So I'd like for you to take it away and share how you'd answer this question from a criminal justice perspective.
Sure. So I looked at this from a disenfranchisement perspective of justice-involved persons. And when I say justice-involved persons, I mean voting rights of individuals who are at different stages in the process. So sometimes we only think of inmates for this, but there are individuals who are currently detained who have not yet had their trial, who are in a jail facility and they are eligible to vote. There are some individuals who are in a jail who have been convicted, and depending on state, they may or may not be eligible to vote, depending on the level of the crime, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony. We do have individuals who are in prison for a long-term period of time, and all states and the federal government do not allow for those individuals to vote. They're not eligible to vote. But then we also have individuals who are out in the community who have served their time in prison and who are on parole, and depending on their crime, if they were convicted of a felony, they may or may not be able to vote depending on state. And just even recently, there were a few states that banned their right to vote for their lifetime if they were convicted of a felony. So one of the things I think is important that we look at is who is even eligible to vote if they've been involved in the criminal justice system. And that kind of information is not as readily available to justice-involved persons to know if they're eligible or not eligible, and where do they find that information. And especially with those individuals who are currently incarcerated in a jail, it's not as easy to be able to access a paper ballot or to access the internet where you can get the information for the paper ballot to be mailed to someone. And Dr. Morris talked earlier about even the mailing process, and we're seeing a lot of questions surrounding that from individuals in the community. But let's think for a moment of individuals who are in an incarceration period, and during that period of time, the mail system that's there. The mail system takes a long period of time. There's a lot of delays. So when we look at the mail-in ballot process and the registration process, you have to hit certain deadlines. And when you have to hit certain deadlines, it makes it a little more difficult for individuals to meet those deadlines when, for example, in Pennsylvania, all of the mail goes through Florida with a third-party processing center. So even in taking that into account of what that time delay would look like for a mail-in ballot is important to be able to look at. And when we're talking about individuals who are justice involved, there's about 6.4 million people who are under some sort of court supervision. And out of that number, 2.1 people are currently incarcerated. So when we look at this, the Sentencing Project had noted that that is equivalent to about 2.5% of the US voting age population. So when we're looking at the number of individuals, there are a number who are disenfranchised. And when we look at that even further in terms of the makeup of our prison and jail populations, we have a disproportionate number of individuals who are from minority communities and from lower income communities. So when we start to look at disenfranchisement of large segments of population, they do have major consequences in terms of, socially, economically, and politically. So then we start to ask that question, should individuals who are justice involved even have the right to retain the right to vote? So, the right to vote is the foundation of our democracy. It's our civic duty. Some of the benefits that justice involved persons might maintain is to put them on a better path for rehabilitation. Having some sense of community and being part of society is necessary. However, others may argue that if this individual has violated the law and the social contract, that they really shouldn't have the decision or the opportunity to right to vote, or the right to vote. And when we think about that, there's others that would suggest if you're not willing to follow the law, then you shouldn't have a role in making the law, whether that is something that's the referendum on the ballot, or electing individuals who are in positions that you would have to follow the law as well. So choosing lawmakers or law enforcers. And it really becomes interesting when you look at that in relation to people who are incarcerated in a jail, where we have some elected positions, which are sheriffs, who may be running the jail. Are you going to vote for or against that individual? For prosecutors, for judges who are involved in the process as well. So those are some things to consider, but also those logistics, some of which I mentioned about, voter registration, the mail system, the voter ID laws that Dr. Morris mentioned as well. In some of those states, it's very difficult for an incarcerated person to come out and to have proper state issued identification. So in those states, it may also be impacted. And even with the absentee ballot, when you look at the absentee ballot, incarceration is not one of those acceptable responses for why the individual is not able to get to their polling place. So those are some of the things that I think are concerned that kind of limit access to individuals who are justice involved to be able to participate in the voting process. There are some suggestions that different government agencies and advocacy agencies have talked about with regard to doing some outreach with local election officials and sheriffs to talk about the voting rights of people who are in jail. Providing election resources to justice involved persons. One that I thought was really interesting that I just never thought of was designate a jail to actually be a formal voter registration agency, where they can have their ballots actually dropped off there. I saw that this actually occurred in Rhode Island with their Department of Corrections, and also in Washington, D.C. with one of its jails as well. So I think that that's kind of unique. There are also some other alternatives too. Due to time, I won't go through any of those. But when Dr. Morris mentioned Florida, I don't know why Florida always comes up in elections, but Florida was one of those states where there was a lifetime ban on voting for individuals who were released from the criminal justice system, but were convicted of a felony. So just recently, the Amendment 4 was passed, where individuals would be able to vote as long as they have satisfied or remedied any fines, fees, and restitution. And interestingly enough, for those individuals, we've seen Michael Bloomberg from New York City, former mayor there, have pumped a lot of money, $16 million, into Florida to help with paying court fines and fees for nearly 32,000 Black and Hispanic Florida voters with felony convictions. Additionally, for students, you may have heard of LeBron James, whether you're from Cleveland or Laker fan, wherever you are at this point. His organization that he has touted called More Than a Vote, which also has other athletes and celebrities who are involved with this nonprofit, has recently donated $100,000 to help these individuals pay their fines and fees, specifically in Florida. So you may have seen that in the news recently too. So that Florida connection, I think, is pretty important.
Thanks, Dr. Garase. That was all really interesting, and I had never considered the using a prison as a voting drop-off site as well. I thought that's a really interesting approach to that. I like that suggestion. We had two questions come through as you were talking here, and I think that this is a good segue for everybody to answer. They definitely involve criminal justice, but I think they'll also pull from some other disciplines too. So I'll start with the first question. Is there a certain amount of psychology involved in either criminal justice or intelligence when it comes to looking at voting populations and trying to decipher current or future behaviors and patterns?
Future behaviors and patterns for how they will vote?
Yes, and if that is not your forte, that's okay. We can jump to somebody else.
I think I need a minute to think about that.
That's okay. You take your time and do that. Does anybody else want to take this question?
Yeah, it's just because the intelligence is mentioned there. I'm sure Dr. Morris has a lot more to talk about the psychology of voting with you about, and mine is definitely not on that. However, yes, psychology is a huge part and an important part of intelligence practice and understanding how intelligence is applied as a form of statecraft, right? So as I said at the beginning, intelligence is a multidisciplinary activity. It's not standalone, much like political science or criminology, you know, ensconced in sociology, and the newer advanced studies in cyber, like that we have through Dr. Mansour. So we actually take from all of that, and many of my colleagues throughout my career have been actual psychologists. I work with psychologists every day, depending on what type of operational activity I was involved in. Polygraph is hugely psychologically based, and of course that dovetails into criminology too in some ways. But importantly, just the roots of critical thinking, right, which I think most of us here are interested in promoting in our students, are founded in psychology. The best writings on critical thinking and some of the best approaches, so certainly the ones that I use, are founded in psychology. So absolutely, it's a great minor. It's a great double major. You know, if you were gonna be in intelligence studies, or I would argue probably in any of these places, it's a really helpful perspective to have when you're going out into the professional world and doing some of this work. So, Dr. Morris, sorry.
Yeah, no, it was well said. I would just add very briefly that political science has an entire subfield called political psychology. If political scientists are really good at anything, it's scavenging stuff. We love to go hang out in other departments and hear what they're talking about and then borrow it and use it to explain political behavior. So psychology factors into a much of what we do in political science. And most major research universities will have a political psychologist on the faculty there, usually studying voter behavior.
A quick thing, if I may add here, back from, of course, adding to what my colleague said. In cybersecurity, we also are interested in the psychology that goes behind the scenes of hackers themselves, about what would they do in certain scenarios, why are they planning to target these particular things, and how do they think about the threats and what is the main objective. This also relates in the psychology, and we're always, in our department, I personally am not a psychology expert at all. I talk technology and engineering most of the time, but we always are interested in learning about that, the psychology of the hackers and the nefarious actors that target our systems and go behind things that we don't expect sometimes.
Right, and of course, just to piggyback on you, Chris, too quickly, because of course, all social engineering has a psychological basis to it, right? They're getting into the way we think so that they can, you know, lure us in to click on that link, or to do that activity that's going to allow them access to our data.
It's all about actually leveraging the trust that we have, and that's a psychological aspect of manipulation.
And if I could just add, I think I misunderstood the question of how can a criminal justice person decide or use psychology to know how someone was voting yes or no or something like that. But in terms of psychology, absolutely, we have a criminology concentration, which is all about why individuals are motivated to commit or not to commit crime. And looking at that from not only a micro perspective, but also a macro perspective with regard to policies concerning crime control and crime prevention as well. We do have an interdisciplinary minor called Psychology of Crime and Justice, where we mesh classes with the Department of Psychology with our department as well, to really have a well-rounded package for someone who is interested in both majors, for them to really have a better understanding of why people do the things that they do, whether it's to get them into the criminal justice system or into a mental health system as well. So yes, we definitely also have a strong tie with psychology and also sociology if we're looking more at a macro level about certain policies and why groups and organizations respond in the ways that they do as well with crime and criminality.
Fantastic. And I think this is a great segue into our final question of the evening, because I see that we're approaching 8 o'clock here. So the admissions office wanted to use this event as an opportunity to show students what a classroom setting is like at Mercyhurst. As a liberal arts institution, you're not only going to take classes in your major, you're going to take classes in English, art, history, political science. You may take an intelligence course or a cybersecurity course every now and again. So I'd like for each of you to talk a little bit about your teaching style and your approach to these types of topics in this classroom setting at Mercyhurst. And you can kind of expand on that however you'd like. So Dr. Corpora, I'll start with you. We'll just go back around the horn then.
You always pick on me. Okay, no problem. I'm probably a little less traditional than most. I tell my students the minute they walk in the doors, I hate tests and I hate grades. I think they're largely useless, right? So you guys are spending a lot of money to come here and learn something, so you should be oriented toward wanting to learn. And I can evaluate your learning through your production, right? Through your communication, whether it be in written form or in the way that you ask a question, how often you're actually engaging with the material that I'm trying to put in front of you. And I think that's important. Of course, we have to give grades, and there are tests occasionally, even in my classes. But all that said, you know, that's sort of my orientation. I take a sort of Socratic approach. I see you all as adults coming in. And your knowledge is going to mature as you move through. So increasingly, I give you the opportunity to discover different things. I put vignettes in front of you, whether it be an article, whether it be a video, whether it be an exercise that we go through in class. I try to use all of those fairly balanced way. I try to buttress that in a sort of Socratic method, which means asking and answering a lot of questions. So I try to encourage you to ask me a lot of questions, and I ask you a lot of questions. And through that interaction of trying to answer these questions, some of them very difficult to answer, if answerable at all, it's still important. And I think that it's important to think about thinking. So I try to get you to be reflective. Always a big part of my the student participation grade is something along the lines of a reflective journal or a vlog or something along those lines. It makes it a little bit fun, but gets you into that more reflective space. So you think about how this knowledge that you're being introduced to, how it impacts you, how you see it in your world.
Thanks so much. Dr. Morris, I want to add one additional question onto my initial question. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any hands-on experiences that the political science department or any program on campus may have for students who, want to get involved in subjects maybe like what we're talking about tonight.
Sure. Then I'll answer that question instead, but I will answer your first one very briefly. And I will tell you that my colleagues in the Department of Political Science love what they do. So you're likely to find in our classrooms faculty members having a really good time, and that enjoyment of that exploring that subject it's contagious. So we have a really good time in our classes. But I think one thing that is true about Mercyhurst in general, not just the political science department, is that you're going to have your hands on something really quickly. Something related to your discipline very, very quickly. We believe that one of the best ways to learn is learn by doing. And yeah, we all offer internships, but we go well beyond that at Mercyhurst. For example, in the political science department, I run the Center for Applied Politics, which is a state-of-the-art public opinion polling facility. And every semester, I work primarily with freshmen, but also some student employees that are upperclassmen to conduct public opinion polls. And these public opinion polls are just like the polls you see in the New York Times or on CNN or on Fox News, because sometimes they are those polls. We've been used, our polls have been reported by every major cable news network, the New York Times, Washington Post, and it's, again, work that is all done by freshmen. So we truly believe that getting you engaged in outside of the classroom is incredibly important. I know I speak not just for my department, but for Mercyhurst as a whole.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. Dr. Mansour, both questions passed over to you.
So basically, I couldn't agree more with what my colleagues have just said. Something special about Mercyhurst is the fact that from the moment you enter the gates to the college, you get the amazing learning experience that we all work hard to give you. I tell my students all the time, treat me as your older brother. So you're all like my younger brothers and sisters, and you're here spending the best time of your life, which is basically this 18 to 21, 22 years old. And then you're spending a lot of money, whether yours or your parents, into the education. So get the best out of it. How can you get the best out of it? By using me and using my colleagues, leveraging the information that we have to provide you. Come knock at our doors. We're always available for you. Our doors are always open now with social distancing, but before also even in person. Now, the thing about Mercyhurst is the moment you step foot on campus, you are to expect a wonderful learning experience. In classrooms, we're always bringing the state-of-the-art research that we find outside. I can talk about cyber. We're always up to date of what's going on outside, from ransomware to viruses to malicious software, any kind of activity that we think it's important for you to know about. From your first semester as a freshman, in the cyber lab, you get to hack passwords, crack certain software, do certain attacks. Of course, contained to be safe so that you don't end up in the news for the wrong reason. And at the same time, we teach you those ethically so that you do not go outside and do them on your perform those attacks on your neighbors. And grades, as Dr. Corpora said, same thing, I agree with him. Grades are one aspect of the education. It's not all. You shouldn't be here just to get an A. You should be here to learn the material. And you can get the A if you just practice and move one step with us at a time. And if you understand that, then that A comes along with it. And again, we as professors are for your service. My suggestion, use us, leverage the time we give you, and we're always there. And I can speak for all my colleagues. They're always available for any support that you may need.
Thanks, Dr. Mansour. And Dr. Garase, if you could round us out this evening.
Sure, I agree with all of my colleagues here as well. I know in our department, from when students step on campus, that we are very student-centered with you know, how we approach our classes, whether that is a lot of interactivity, a lot of discussion-based courses where we're talking about important issues of the times. We're also being reflective too on what we've learned and how that connects with other areas of psychology and sociology and social work and political science and so forth. We also do project-based learning too, so that there is some group work that needs to be done and some team formation, as well as some delegation of responsibility and being able to get larger tasks done and being able to utilize the knowledge of their classmates to be able to look at certain issues from different lenses, being able to put that together, put it into a presentation. And for example, in one of our classes, we have students do experiential learning and service learning. They worked with a justice-involved organization, and they have to do a group project, and then they present it with the director of the agency there. So there's a lot of connectivity with the classmates, with the students and the faculty, and organizations in the community. And there's just a lot of knowledge building and skill building and competency building that goes along with that, that is just, you know, putting the package together for our students so that when they are going out for that entry-level position, that they do have the skill set that is needed and that they are able to perform in the jobs that they are looking for. So I think all of those things, we start at freshman year and we keep building on them as we go through until they're a senior. So all of those things I think are in play, not only in our departments, but other departments on campus. And like I said, we do have students that take advantage also of double majors and minors, where that interdisciplinary knowledge is just really, really important.
As you can tell by all 5 of our head nods, we all agree with that.
If I can add
And I
something
think,
really, sorry, if I can
sure.
add something really quick. So for to give an example of what Dr. Garase just said, I have a student who has, I always use her as an example, and I tell her that I use your case as an example. She's doing double majoring in intelligence studies and cybersecurity. She's minoring in political science, religious studies, and one other minor. That is something Mercyhurst is amazing in offering our students. The way you can build and shape your education is not available at any other place. And we always, as faculty, support that. So the student meets with multiple advisors, and we're all on the same page, trying to advise her onto moving forward to finish on time with all these courses that she picked. I just wanted to bring that up because this is something that you can shape your education at Mercyhurst.
Thank you, Dr. Mansour. And that's what we tell students all the time when we meet with them. You can shape your education to be anything you would like it to be at Mercyhurst. And I think that's something that all of my colleagues in admissions, all of our faculty, we could all agree in saying that our campus is a special place, with that being one of the many reasons why. And you can see even in our conversation today, how all of these departments interconnect with each other, and real life experiences definitely intertwine with many different disciplines. So being able to get the experiences in a wide variety of fields is really helpful when it comes to finding a career and figuring out where you want to go in the future. So, well, I want to thank our 4 panelists for their incredible discussion this evening. I found this to be very interesting. I hope that all of you did as well. If any of you would like to speak more in detail with our faculty once this event is over, you can set up an individual virtual visit. We can set up something very similar like this with just you and one of our professors in any departments that you're interested in, to talk a little bit more about our curriculum, opportunities to double major, and how our programs can meet your goals when it comes to your education. All of our events and ways to register for these types of virtual visits can be found on our website. I see that Rebecca just put it in the chat. It's mercyhurst.edu/visit. So please do not hesitate, set up a visit. I know that our 4 faculty here, as well as our others who are not here with us, would be more than happy to speak with you and tell you what makes Mercyhurst a special place and what makes their department a unique place to study that specific field. So we hope we see you guys again soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and carpe diem. Thanks, everybody.